Ready? Exodus 3, 1-22, Moses and the burning bush. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the fat side of the wilderness, and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames on fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. Why, the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abram, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people to the Israelites out of Egypt, beg your pardon. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you, and I have seen what has been done to you in Egypt, and I have promised to bring you out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord, our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favourably disposed towards this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbour, and any woman living in her house, for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians.
Thanks, Sophie. Didn't she do well with all those names? Struggling with this. There we go. So when John introduced this series on Exodus a few weeks ago, he said it's a book, a story about God keeping his promises. And I agree with that. I think this is a story for anyone who has ever questioned where God is, for anyone who's ever felt alone or abandoned, confused or desperate, for anyone who can't understand why they're going through what they're going through, for anyone who's ever asked, where is God in all of this? This is a story about God rescuing his people from a land where they were slaves and taking them out into a land of their own. But it's also a foreshadowing, an insight, a picture, a mirror of a greater story. Because everything that God is doing in the book of Exodus for the Israelites in a physical sense is a picture of what God is doing through Jesus for the whole of humankind in a spiritual sense. Jesus is setting people free. It's a story of a creator God who loves his people and has heard our cry from within our own darkness and our own lostness. And it's a God who will not leave us there and has come into our darkness to bring us out into his kingdom. So I think we've got three intertwined stories here. We've got the story of the man Moses, we've got the story of the people, the Israelites, and we've got the story of us, of all creation, the bigger story of God. And in the passage that Sophie read to us just now, we hear God promising to fulfill a covenant. And it was a covenant that he made with Abraham. And so I thought it'd be useful to go back and look at that covenant. So remember that Abraham was called by God to be the father of a new nation, a chosen people. And in Genesis 15, you'll find the covenant that God makes with Abraham. I'll just read a few verses of it. Genesis 15:12. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions." And then skipping to verses 18 and 20 of Genesis 15. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." So that's the promise, the covenant which God made with Abraham roughly 500 years before the events of the story that we're looking at today, Moses and the burning bush. And Abraham had a son called Isaac, and Isaac's son was Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons who became the founding fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of those sons, Joseph, was favoured more than the others, and the others got jealous, and they sold him to some traders who were on their way to Egypt. So Joseph ended up as a slave in Egypt. You know the story, and he had a bit of a roller coaster time there, and he ended up interpreting the dream that God had given the Pharaoh at the time to warn of an impending famine. And then under Joseph's guidance, the Egyptians were able to stockpile enough food to see them through those years of famine. And during that time of famine, Jacob and the remaining 11 sons and their families, they came to Egypt in search of food, and after a little bit of drama they were reunited with Joseph, and they ended up settling there. And that brings us to the start of the book of Exodus, where the Israelites had grown in number, and Joseph and the other brothers had long gone, and the new king had become afraid of the Israelites because they'd grown in number, and he'd enslaved them. And then at the beginning of the story of Exodus, which John took us through, we have these heroic women, the midwives, and then Moses' mother and sister and Pharaoh's daughter, that end up with Moses being adopted into the royal family and growing up as a prince in Egypt. And then last week, Margaret took us through how Moses had to flee from Egypt after he had murdered an Egyptian who was beating one of the Hebrews, and how he ended up in Midian, and he got married and had a family of his own. So that's the background to where we arrive now with Moses in chapter 3 of Exodus, and this extraordinary encounter between Moses and God involving a burning bush. probably one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. But as we read through these verses in Exodus, it's easy for us to miss the timeline, especially as it's not explicit in the text here. But there's also an account of these events given by Stephen in the book of Acts when he's talking in front of the Sanhedrin. And what we learn from that is he tells us that Moses was 40 years old when he killed the Egyptian and he had to flee to Midian. And that another 40 years had passed when God appeared to him in the burning bush. So he's 80 years old at this point. He's no spring chicken anymore. When we're young, we think we can do anything, don't we? I know I did. We think we can change the world. We have big dreams and big plans, and nothing is going to stop us. But for one reason or another, often it doesn't work out like that. Maybe we set out to accomplish those dreams, but we discover that changing the world is not as easy as we thought it was. We fail. Often because we try to do things in our own way, in our own timing, rather than in God's way and in God's timing. Moses had a passion to rescue his people. And there was nothing wrong with that. In fact, it was a passion that had been put there by God. It was his calling, if you like. But he had tried to work it out in his own way, in his own time, and he had failed miserably. Moses succeeded in burying one Egyptian in the sand. But we discover later that God's plan was to bury the entire army in the sea. Moses had a passion to rescue his people, but he'd stepped out in his own time and he'd failed. And now, after wandering in the desert for 40 years, God is about to revive that calling in Moses and commission him afresh. Now, I spend a lot of time taking Grace over to Bath to do her gymnastics training, and I've got into a habit where I try at least once a week to go on a bit of a run, a jog around the streets of Bath whilst waiting for Grace. Nothing like what Mike does, but just enough to keep me kind of a bit fit. But those times are good times for me to think and pray. And often if I've got a preach coming up, I'll use those times to talk to God about, what is it in the passage that you want me to bring up. So a few weeks ago, I was running my normal route around the streets of Bath, and I was thinking, well, what is it about this story about the burning bush, which we want to share this morning? And the thing which I couldn't get out of my mind was this gap of 40 years between when Moses had tried to step into his calling and when God had revived his calling. And I had a sense that maybe there'd be a person here this morning, or maybe listening to the recording, for whom this will resonate. When you were younger, you had a vision that you believed was from God, and maybe you stepped into that and you tried something, you tried to do something about it, and for one reason or another it didn't work out. And since then it's kind of been dormant within you. Life happens, doesn't it? You get a responsibility, you get a job, you get a mortgage, you get a family, you get ill health, I don't know what it is, but you feel like you've been in the desert for 40 years, or however long it is. I don't know how long it is. You don't have the energy that you used to. You're not as young as you used to be, and those dreams have faded. If that's resonating with you this morning, then maybe today is your burning bush moment. Maybe today is the day you stand on holy ground. And don't think you're too old. Don't think that boat has sailed. Don't think it's for younger people to do. Moses was 80 years old when he stood at the burning bush. And he thought he'd blown it. What he didn't know, but was about to find out, was that those 40 years were in fact preparation for what God was about to do through him. So here's Moses, and he's looking after his sheep in the desert, and he's doing the same thing day after day. And he sees this bush which is burning but not being consumed, and so he goes closer to have a look. And as he approaches, God calls out to him and tells him to take off his sandals because the ground he's standing on is holy. Now he's on just normal desert scrubland. He's been searching for some greenery, some grass for his sheep to feed on. There was nothing special about that place to make it holy. He's not standing in some great temple. He hasn't come across some ancient altar. It's just a normal barren patch of land on the far side of the desert. But it has become holy because the presence of God is there. The presence of God makes it holy ground. And I think God would remind us this morning that we carry within us the presence of God. We have the Spirit of God dwelling within us. And that means today that I am standing on holy ground and you are sitting on holy ground. And every place you set your foot is holy ground because you take the presence of God with you. God doesn't stay here in the church building and leave us as we go out and about during our week. He goes with us into our workplaces, into our schools, into our clubs, into our activities, whatever it is that we get up to. God is in the business of taking the ordinary and making it holy. That's the grace of God. And I think we see the grace of God here with Moses as well. God is the God of the second chance, isn't he? Moses stands in front of that bush as a murderer, as a failure, probably broken. And yet God invites him to stand on holy ground. And he introduces himself by saying, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Now, I think there's two significant reasons why God introduces himself in that way. Firstly, I think God is reminding Moses of his identity, his heritage. You see, when Moses escaped from Egypt, he identified himself as an Egyptian. In chapter 2, Jethro's daughters go back and they say that an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds by the well. And then when Moses' son was born, he named him Gershom, which means foreigner. And he said, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. Moses had lost his sense of identity, but God is reminding him that he is not an Egyptian and he is not a foreigner, but he is an Israelite. He is part of God's chosen people, part of this lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that no doubt Moses would have connected God's covenant that he'd made with Abraham, God's promise about the future of the Israelites and their destiny and Moses' own destiny. Somehow, I think, over those 40 years, that hope had got lost in Moses. So God is including Moses in the bigger story. And he reminds Moses that he is the God of the covenant. He has made a promise to Abraham to bring his people out of a foreign land and to provide a land of their own. And God keeps his promises. And now is the time when his promise will begin to be fulfilled. I wonder if sometimes we need reminding of our identity, our heritage, and our destiny. Have we taken on an identity that is not supposed to define us? Have we allowed our past to define us, our mistakes, our regrets, our failures? Have we allowed the world and the world's values to define us, the world's definition of success and failure? In the presence of God, standing on holy ground, Moses had his identity restored. And this is a foreshadow of the work of Jesus. Jesus does not define you by your mistakes. Jesus does not define you by what you've done. Jesus does not define you by the values that the world places on you. Jesus defines you by who you were made to be. in the presence of God, standing on holy ground, Jesus reframes your identity away from the values and the cultures of the world and back to who he says you are. It's in God's presence that we're reminded of our identity, and it's in God's presence that we're released into our calling. And that's what God is doing here with Moses. In verse 9 he says, "And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." God tells Moses to go. But Moses says to God, "Who am I that I should go? Who am I?" Gone is the arrogance of his youth. Gone is the prince of Egypt. He argues in the next chapter that he can't speak very well, and yet Acts tells us that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. 40 years in the desert has humbled Moses, looking after sheep, and not even his own sheep. They belong to his father-in-law. He's an old man. Surely, God, it would have been better to have sent Moses when he was a young prince in Egypt, confident and bold. Not now after these 40 years in the desert, that he's a broken and old man. So who am I to do this? Moses asks. But notice that God doesn't answer that question. Instead, he replies with the statement, "I will go with you." And that's the point. It's not about who you are, Moses. It's about who I am. And this very much mirrors the commission, I think, that Jesus gave his followers in Matthew 28. "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, and I am with you always to the very end of the age." It's not about who we are. It's about who God is. It's not about what we can do for God. It's about what God does through us. And his promise is to be with us. So then Moses wants to know who God is, what's his name. And this, I think, was a reasonable question in the context. I did a bit of reading on this. And before this time, when God has revealed himself to people, he'd always revealed himself with a name that describes some characteristic of himself. So in Genesis 14, he is God the Most High. In Genesis 16, he is the God who sees. In Genesis 17, he is God the Almighty. In Genesis 21, he is the everlasting God. In Genesis 22, he is the God who provides. So every time he'd revealed himself, he'd given a descriptive name for himself. So if Moses went to the elders of Israel speaking on God's behalf, it would be logical for them to ask, by what name did he reveal himself to you? Moses has gone from who am I to who are you? He's asking the right question. He's stopped focusing on himself and he's now focusing on God. But God doesn't give him a name, at least not at first. He simply says, "I am who I am. Say to the Israelites, I am has sent you." I am who I am. It's not possible to describe God with a name. You cannot equate God to anything. He is self-existent. He's not created. He's eternal. He didn't have a beginning. He simply was and is and always has been. And he has no end. He didn't come into being and he cannot go out of being. He simply is. God is absolute. But this phrase, I am, it also carries with it a meaning of presence, a sense of presence. I am present. I am with you. It very much reflects God's intention to be with his people. So God says, I am who I am. Say to the Israelites, I am has sent you. But he does then go on to give Moses a name. In verse 15, God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. And that word translated there as Lord in the NIV, and if you see it written down, you'll see it's all in capitals. That's Yahweh. And everywhere you see that in the Old Testament with Lord in capitals, it's Yahweh. It's the name that God gave to Moses to describe himself. And I've been trying to find the meaning of Yahweh. And it's quite interesting because unlike most Hebrew names, it doesn't have a meaning. It's not possible for it to have a meaning because it's the name of God who cannot be described by a name. But it does sound a little bit like the Hebrew phrase for I am, which is Ehyeh. It sounds a little bit similar to Yahweh. So some of the scholars think that that's where this name Yahweh comes from. So God gives Moses his name Yahweh. And what happened was that the Israelites didn't want to pronounce the full name of God because they feared they would blaspheme it. So they shortened it. When it was written down, they'd only write the consonants. And when they said it, they would often shorten it just to Yah, not the full name. So you end up with words like Hallelujah, coming from Hallel, meaning praise, and Yah, meaning God. And then in Matthew 1:21, when God is speaking to Joseph through a dream about Mary, he says to Joseph, "She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." Now the name Jesus in Hebrew is Yahshua. Shua meaning salvation, and Yah, the name of God. So Jesus literally means God's salvation, Yahweh's salvation. I find this stuff really interesting. I hope some of you do as well. Jesus, of course, took on this title of I am for himself. In John 8, he's in discussion with the teachers of the law, and they ask him, Abraham died and so did the prophets, and yet you say whoever obeys your word will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham? He died and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are? And Jesus replied, If I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him and obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You are not yet 50 years old, they said to him, and you have seen Abraham. Very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. So Jesus very clearly taking on the name of God, claiming to be God. And of course we know his other I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. You know, for those Israelites in slavery in Egypt, I imagine they would have wondered, where is God? Where is he in our suffering? Has he abandoned us? And yet twice in the passage today we have God saying that he has heard their cry and he is doing something about it. Not only to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians, but to lead them into their own land. In verse 17 he says, I have promised to bring you out of your misery in Egypt into the lands of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And I will make the Egyptians favourably disposed towards this people, so that when you leave you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbour and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. A fulfillment of the covenant that God had made to Abraham. Remember in Genesis 15, God said afterwards they will come out with great possessions. And they would possess a land of their own. So I'll end where I began. This is a story for anyone who has questioned where God is, for anyone who has ever felt alone and abandoned and confused and desperate. For anyone who can't understand why you're going through what you're going through, where is God in all of this? Does he love me? This is a story which is a mirror, a shadow of a greater story, and the answer is found in the purpose and promise, the person and promise of Jesus, the great I am, who became flesh and blood and entered into our darkness, experiencing the worst that we could throw at him, even the pain of the cross. Where is God, we cry? He's right here with us, and he is a God who keeps his promises. We may walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We may walk a path of suffering, but we walk on holy ground, because we don't walk alone and we don't walk without a destination. We have a future and a hope that is steadfast and certain, because we trust in a God who always keeps his promises. Whatever current situation you're going through, whatever it is that's worrying you at the moment, this is not your final destination. Hebrews tells us to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, and Philippians, that he who began a good work in us will bring it to completion. And the story of Exodus tells us that we have a God who keeps his promises. Amen.